Grief literacy. How can we come together to build compassionate communities? Hello, I'm Kathy Supiano, and I'm the Director of Caring Connections at the University of Utah College of Nursing. Let's talk about what grief literacy is. Grief literacy is a goal within a larger international movement called the Compassionate Communities Movement. We all recognize now that our society and societies around the globe are fragmented. We have varying norms and traditions to support one another in times of suffering. These norms are unclear, and increasing grief knowledge would equip all of us, both the public and professionals, to identify grief and suffering in others in our community more readily and activate appropriate supports in ways that are proactive and can avoid the unnecessary complications from grief and suffering that we know can happen. Complications like isolation and increased suicide risk. In addition to the formal care offered by grief counselors such as myself and mental health clinicians and palliative care and hospice care professionals, the grief literacy movement recognizes that there's a need to equip all citizens to support one another in times of loss and bereavement. Today, I'd like to provide a framework for multiple communities, both social and community agencies, as well as churches and neighborhoods, to enhance supportive care and contribute to mitigating the risk of suicide. Some of you are familiar with images that illustrate the distribution of public health concerns. This is an example of a public health pyramid. In a study done a few years ago in Australia, the nation was surveyed about the nature of the bereavement experiences of all the citizens in Australia. Their findings are very consistent with what we know to be true in the United States. We know that there is, as a public health concern, a high risk of what is called prolonged grief that occurs in about 10% of individuals who are grieving the death of a family member or friend. These are people who, because of the nature and severity of their grief and the complications of their lives, need specific forms of psychotherapy to address their disabling grief. However, we know that most people who navigate grief do so successfully, yet they may be at moderate risk for the complications of uncared for grief, and therefore need specific clinician-facilitated support, either clinician-facilitated support groups or individual counseling to address the magnitude of their loss. Other people still in the category of moderate risk benefit from peer support groups. In our own community, groups like the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Compassionate Friends, and NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, offer wonderful peer support to groups to help people navigate loss and suffering in their own lives. We also know, though, that the vast majority of people who experience the death or loss of someone dear to them, someone who's integral to their own life and identity, navigate grief on their own. This is about 60% of all people who are grieving now and across all circumstances of grief. These are the people who benefit from living in a grief-literate community. We're going to focus today on how we build that grief-literate community. Let me invite each of you to consider all the people you know who are grieving. You, yourself as a person who might be grieving or who was grieving, or other grievers you are aware of. Who are the individuals who benefit from support in the presence of loss? Well, let me introduce you to some of these people. Here we have a young woman who's in the obstetrician's office and has gotten this news. Her doctor says, "We can't hear a heartbeat, and it appears that the baby has died. We'll need to induce labor for you to deliver the baby." Or consider this gentleman in his late 60s, now on the phone with his son. His son says to him, "Hello, Dad. We just had the police come over to our house and tell us they found Tom dead. It looks like he's died of a drug overdose." Or consider this gentleman, a man in his mid-80s. His wife has just died of Alzheimer's disease. He says to himself, "I took care of her with her dementia for the last 10 years. How can I live without her? How can I manage while she's gone?" And here, a young woman, a senior in high school, whose brother has just died by suicide, and she says to herself, "Why would my brother die? He has so much to live for." And finally, this little girl, a 10-year-old, at the graveside of her father, and she says to herself, "What will I do without my daddy?" So I invite you to reflect on how to support these people in the presence of loss. Let's turn this around from where I live as a grief therapist. I will share with you what grievers tell us they hear and see every day out in the real world, the very world that's going on without them, while their world has tragically been ground to a halt. This young woman who lost her baby might say something like this: "I've been talking with my girlfriends and they say, maybe you're better off without that baby. There must have been something wrong with it." Another friend has said to her, "Well, you're young. You still have time to have another baby." Or our gentleman, the father who shares the news of his son's death with who he thought was a close friend. And the friend says to him, "Well, the world really doesn't need any more addicts anyway." And his next door neighbor who says to him, "At least you don't have to pay for treatment anymore." Consider our older gentleman, now a widow, and everyone in his church community says, "You were a great caregiver, but now think, you can travel again. You've got all this time to spend to enjoy yourself." Or our young woman whose brother has died, and she's surrounded by people who ask this question: how did he do it? The first question that people seem to pose to those who've lost someone to suicide death. And finally, our little girl who has now finished the funeral for her beloved father and stands in the receiving line. And family members say to her, "Now, sweetie, you've got to be strong for your mommy. You're going to have to be a big girl now." These are the statements that grievers tell us they hear and experience out in the real world. So what is grief? If you've heard my talks before, you know I make a strong case that grief is something that will come to all of us. It's part of the human experience. The only way to go through life without grieving is to never love anyone or to be the first to die. So most of us will experience grief, but that's not what we're discussing today. Today we're discussing how you will respond to the grief of others. So for you, I can tell you, grief is a reminder about death. It's a reminder that you too will lose someone, that you too in fact will die. Grief is awkward. More than that, grief is actually really scary. Most of us would rather not go into the room of suffering with another human being. We feel awkward, we feel clumsy, and the truth is we don't know how the griever is going to react. That can make us recognize that we're not actually in control in this situation of bringing comfort. Can we then risk being vulnerable? Can we bring quality grief literacy to the suffering of another human being? Brené Brown, who has written a lot about vulnerability, talks about this, and she tells this story of going to present a lecture. There were sign language interpreters who were there for people with hearing impairments, and they asked her, "How do we sign the word vulnerability?" And she gave this example. This is what the translators said: stumbling. She said, "That's not what I mean by vulnerability." So the translators said, "There's another word for vulnerability, another sign." And they showed her this. The interpreters said, "This is a symbol." And she said, "Yes, being open-hearted." In that spirit, here's my invitation to all of us. Our intention can deepen. How will we be better at this? And my response to that question is compassion. Now, sympathy is a very important part of bringing comfort to grieving people. Sympathy cards, sympathy letters say, "I acknowledge your loss. I acknowledge the magnitude of your loss." We don't want to minimize the value of sympathy. Empathy is also important. Empathy says, "I can identify with your pain because I myself have been a suffering person. I recognize my loss is different from yours, but I understand the pain of suffering." Compassion, which is the highest of these three virtues, is something that says, "I recognize your suffering. I will do something. I will mobilize myself to respond to your suffering in a way that is real and tangible, in a way that truly helps. So let me share this beautiful quote from Shakespeare's Macbeth. Give sorrow words, the grief that does not speak, whispers the overfraught heart and bids it break. That is my invitation to you, to enter the room of suffering, to bring comfort to grievers, to welcome them into a safe space where they can be brokenhearted with you. That's why it's important to remember that grief and suffering are not problems to be solved. They are actually situations to be compassionately engaged in. That means you, as a compassionate person, now enter what I call the room of suffering with a grieving person. And when we do that, it brings a challenge to us. How does it affect us as a compassionate person who's engaging? Well, if we bear witness with a person who's suffering, we participate in that suffering. To bear witness is to participate in that suffering, but it doesn't mean it becomes your suffering. Let's reflect on the person you're trying to support. They're living in the story of their life, and their story is now suffused with suffering. You, when you enter the room of suffering, move into their story, the book of their life, as a very small character in that story. And now, as you enter that story, as a witness to that story, you too will absorb some of that experience to a certain extent, not to take on the pain personally, but to help lift the pain. And by lifting the pain, we engage in that experience. Also, when we bear witness, we assume some responsibility for how the story will go forward. How will this person carry the story forward into their future? When they look back on the story of this loss, who will you be, that little tiny character in their story? Will you be a character that lightens the load, or a character that actually made things worse? So let's think about that. This is a little more formulaic, but we know from all the grievers we care for, we know some things that really do work to bring support to suffering people. The first thing grieving people need is listening. They need to tell the story if they're comfortable telling the story, and they may need to tell that story more than once. What we know, what works for people, is patient listening and re-listening. Over time, we want the griever to feel comfortable telling the story of the death, but as time goes on, and more importantly, to tell the story of the life of the deceased. One of my favorite stories is of a woman whose teenage son was killed tragically and very abruptly. And she was surprised that the day after the funeral, her house was filled with teenage boys, and they were kicking around in her kitchen and telling stories about her son. And they told her this very funny story of when they were all gathered together and they went to toilet paper the houses of the cheerleaders, and the grieving mom had had no idea that her son had ever participated in this activity. And she was able to join in that story of her son that she herself had never been a witness to. And so this is a great gift to be able to give to a grieving person. We also know that people do need basic comforts and kindnesses. They need to be invited to safe social activities that do not demand that they're stronger than they are. Food is important, mowing the lawn is important, taking care of the people in our community is important. When we reach out and do that, regardless of the circumstances of the death, we can make a difference. Also, we can give people the confidence that they can manage. I want to be clear on this. This is not saying you're strong, you'll get through it. Instead, this is saying, I remember when you got through this. I remember when you got through that. And I remember when you helped me through this. Whatever happened then, you were the one who came over to comfort me. That's how we can foster confidence in other people that they can actually manage. But I will remind you, you're not a grief therapist, and it's important to keep your own worry radar up and to know that sometimes people do need more than you are able to give. They do need referrals for professional support, to counselors, to grief support programs, to church support communities. They may need more than you alone can give. But let me also tell you what doesn't work. Telling people your own grief story doesn't work. If you knew how many grievers I've cared for that were very distressed when they were now sharing the experience of a fresh loss and someone said to them, "Oh, you think that's bad when my mother died," or worse, "I know exactly how you feel." Telling your own story is not going to be helpful. But you might be able to say something like this: "When my mother died, I had the hardest time going through her things. So I just encourage you, you don't have to do this in a hurry. Take your time, be patient with yourself." We also know that what does not help is inappropriate premature spiritual support. I will remind you and all of us, you're not God, I'm not God. It's not our place to defend God or the universe. By stating platitudes too early, "Don't worry, he's in heaven," or "God needed that little angel more than you," this is not helpful. If you are a good listener and you're a person of faith and the person that you're comforting is also a person of faith, I can assure you that even if they're shaking their fist at heaven right now, if you have the patience to naturally let this unfold and listen without judgment, most people will right their own spiritual and faith ship in time. They'll recalibrate. I will also tell you very forthrightly that medication does not help grief. I want to be clear. If people have depressive disorders diagnosed and they need medication, they should continue those medications. But there is no pill for grief. Grief is supposed to be full of sorrow. It's supposed to make you cry. It's supposed to bring a flood of feelings. It's supposed to disrupt your sleep. A lot of grief work happens in sleep. And if people take sleeping medication on a long-term basis to help with sleep, they're only kicking their grief down the road to be dealt with later. Sleep medications, and of course America's #1 sleep aid is alcohol. None of this helps with grief. Now, let's further broaden our perspective. I've given you some suggestions on how you as an individual can support grieving people, but what about our community? This is a definition of compassionate communities crafted by the journalist Thomas Friedman. And he says, "The more people are anchored in communities where they feel connected, protected, and respected, the more people are ready to reach out and experiment. They feel safe. The less they feel connected, protected, and respected, the more they'll build walls to protect themselves from change." For grieving people, that means placing themselves in isolation. So let's unpack this a little bit. In healthy communities, in compassionate communities, the citizens of a healthy community are connected. What do we mean by that? They live lives within a safety net of care that supports healthy interrelationships. It's characterized by trust and equips citizens to navigate the wider world. That's what we want, particularly with children feeling connected. They feel safe enough that they can navigate the wider world as they grow out from their own families into healthy communities. Citizens that are also respected. By that, we mean they're listened to, they're cared about, they're cared for. They're encouraged to share their own gifts, their talents, their ideas with each other and with the larger world. They are honored for being who they are. Just that. That's enough, not anything they have or their power or their titles. And finally, in healthy communities, the community members are protected. That means the young, the old, the suffering, the vulnerable are shielded from harm by the community. It means that when harm happens, the community then responds by nurturing them and resourcing them. Let me remind you of some wise words from Therese Rando, one of the original great grief therapists in the United States. And this is what she tells us: "We cannot take away the pain from the bereaved." In fact, even if we could, we shouldn't. When people are struggling or in pain or confusion, as they are remembering the work of that relationship, it's painful, but they have to do it and they can do it. But they do it better if they're kindly and gently companioned through that and accompanied on their grief journey. Grief is not a problem to be solved. Grief is a situation to be companioned. There is an image that a wonderful spiritual advisor shared with me. If you look at this image, you will see, if you look carefully, old, rotting, brown support beams beneath the subfloor, the support structure of a house. But instead of ripping out all of the supportive foundation of this house, a wise carpenter used an approach called sistering, where brand new, fresh 2x4s were bracketed and bolted to the old fragile boards to strengthen them. The new boards don't tell the old boards how to be a floor, but add this measure of coming alongside and support. How do we do that? How do we come alongside grieving individuals in our community and as a community? First of all, we have to face the fact that everyone grieves differently. Every single person who grieves will grieve every loss they've ever had differently. Grief is not something that follows a formula. It's not one size fits all. It's also unpredictable. If you could sit down with a close friend and have a warm cup of coffee with them and offer grief support to that individual and say, "Wow, she's really doing better. We had such a good talk." And then the next day, she could be convulsed with fear about what's coming around the corner. So unlike other mental health situations, grief that happens one day does not predict what will happen the next day. Grief is very fluid, unpredictable, especially in the first year. And people experience all sorts of thoughts and emotions and feelings like they're in a tornado. The last thing is, there are no magic words. I cannot give you a litany of words of comfort that are going to fit the person you're trying to support. You're going to have to surrender the idea of magic words and instead bring yourself. Tailor your response to what the griever is willing to share with you now. So let's revisit our people. Who needs presence in the support of loss? How might you respond? Now, if you're in the room of suffering with the young woman who's going to deliver her baby as a stillbirth, you might say, "I'm so sorry, this is such a big upheaval. Is there any way I could help? You're going to be feeling sick for a while. Could I take care of your other children? Could I take care of your yard? Would it be all right if I brought something to you to have for dinner?" And now our gentleman whose son has just died from a tragic overdose. "Oh my goodness," you might say, "what a shock. This must be so distressing for you and your family. What is the best way I could help you now?" Our friend who lost his wife after being a caregiver for so many years, how are you feeling about things now? You've been a caregiver for such a long time. How are you feeling about all the changes you're having these days? Our young woman who lost her brother to suicide, how are you feeling right now? I have no idea what this experience must be like for you. How can I support you? Tell me more about your brother. I didn't know him very well. And to our little girl, we might say, "It's okay to feel whatever you're feeling." She says, "I'm frightened." It's okay to be frightened. "I'm worried." It's okay to be worried. "I'm so sad." It's okay to be sad. "Would you like me to tell you a story about your daddy? I knew your daddy from work before you were even born. Let me tell you the story of your daddy's first day at work." It's a very funny story. When it comes to offering tailored support for individual grievers, let's take a page out of the playbook of preschool teachers. If you think about the day-to-day life of preschool teachers that are surrounded by small children, there are tears in preschool every day. One little one gets pushed and falls down. Another can't tie her shoes. Another one's mommy forgot to pack that special treat in the lunchbox. Another one says, "So-and-so is mean to me." Another one says, "So-and-so won't play with me." Preschool teachers deal with tears all day, and they have a three-pronged approach. They ask, do you need help? Do you need to be heard? Or do you need a hug? When we think about approaching grievers, this applies. First, do you need help? What might that help be? bringing a meal, driving your kids to school. I'm just going to show up and mow your lawn quietly or weed your garden. Could I sit down with you and help you with those response cards? Can I just call and check on you? Preschool teachers also just say, do you need to be heard? But they don't use that language. Instead of offering to reach in and tie the shoelaces for that little one who just needs to be coached, can they instead just sit down and listen to their doubts and feelings? When the little one says, I'm never going to tie my shoelaces, just say, it's frustrating, isn't it? For grievers, that means listen to the feelings, listen to the doubts, listen to the story of the death, listen to the story of the life. So, do you need to be helped? Do you need to be heard? And the third thing is, do you need a hug? With little children, hugs carry a lot of capital. With adults, we have to remember, not everyone's a hugger. Presence is the equivalent of a hug for adults. And if they want a hug is great, but not everyone wants a hug. The equivalent of a hug for adults is showing up. It's our presence. So when you now respond to the public health emergency of grief and suffering in our society right now, let's think, who's going to do what? When you see people whose lives are disabled by grief and have prolonged and complicated experiences in their grief, they need people like me to help them with that. When you deal with people out in the world and they're struggling and they need more help than perhaps you can give, perhaps they need formal support, counseling or support groups, or another collection of grieving individuals, you can direct them in toward that support. But for most people, what they need is you and me being kind and doing the work of showing up. And friends, if we cannot bring that compassion to address this, if we cannot bring that grief-literate community to address the majority of people who are having ordinary but exquisitely painful suffering that they're experiencing every day, we have to at least not pile on and hurt them more. Instead, I'm going to ask you to reflect with me on this beautiful quote from Henri Nouwen, who said, when we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving much advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in the moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in the hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is the friend who cares.